Ted Kennedy and George Bush joined hands for the creation of No Child Left Behind and did something that hadn't happened in federal government before, and created a quite intrusive, quite assertive theory about how to invest the federal dollars in public schools. Race to the Top took it to a different level entirely. It makes NCLB look tame, in fact. Race to the Top basically said, you're not going to get these resources. You're not going to get them. You have to compete for them. And you're not going to get them unless you do the things that we tell you you have to do.
So it begins with, what do you call it, right? No Child Left Behind. Very clear idea about what this means. Race to the Top. Also a fairly clear idea about what this means. But I think sending the wrong message, right? Education and improving education is not a race. This isn't a competition. Moreover, this notion of to the top suggests that there's an end point. And I think Arne Duncan and the Obama administration missed a really huge opportunity in framing this particular effort in a way that would send the right message. Part of the reason why No Child Left Behind failed, or failed a lot of kids, is that there was this notion of individual responsibility and accountability, which fits well into this notion of competition that is at odds with the notion of educating and teaching and engaging in a social enterprise, which education is. It's not a competition. It's an effort to build a citizenry that is reliant on others. And competition, racing, and all these things essentially pit people against one another. I mean, Race to the Top effectively pitted states and school districts against one another. And I don't know, fundamentally, I think there are places that is a reasonable effort to engage in, and I'm not sure that education is one of those.
So you probably know that almost all federal education funds are formula-driven. Virtually all of them are. And this administration thought that they wanted to make more competitive grants, and that they wanted to use this competition to incentivize education reforms. And these were the education reforms that this administration bought into or believed in, that included this issue: teacher quality, better teacher evaluation, better assessments, and so forth, higher standards. So, I think in the beginning, Race to the Top was seen as sort of wildly creative and a wonderful way to go. But the kind of what we're hearing now is more and more criticisms about the federal government overreaching by using these incentives to force states to do sort of federally driven reforms, when they're, part of the backlash is because there's more and more sentiment that this is federal overreach and that the reforms belong to the states and locals. And there are evaluation studies. Even my former agency, the Institute of Education Sciences, is conducting an evaluation of Race to the Top. So there will be data will unfold that'll tell us what's happening and whether it had any of its, it reached any of its intended goals.
As with the No Child Left Behind policy, I don't know that they had a lot of evidence behind the policies that they wanted schools to enact. There was a lot of theory and some suggestive evidence that the reforms would be helpful for schools. But it's, again, very experimental. So it was a lot of money and a lot of energy, again, just like with No Child Left Behind, put behind reforms that were mostly untested.
Never before had we had, in essence, competitions at this scale nationally, where you're pitching state against state, saying you do these things or you don't get $300 or $400 or $500 million. And that was in a context where everybody was short of money. The economy was crashing. So everybody, like state legislatures across the great nation, stepped up and said, okay, we'll do teacher accountability. Let's do that. What do we base it on? Oh, all we have is standardized test scores. We'll base it on that. So how much should a teacher be evaluated based on standardized test scores? 20%, 30%, 50%? Let's try 50, and maybe we'll get 300 or 500 million. And underneath that was this predicament, which is that, again, we had some of the best methodologists and economists and scientists saying, maybe this isn't the best idea. Like maybe the value add measures that we're basing these decisions on don't or won't quite hold up. There was at least a sort of a set of fundamental questions between really clever observers of the educational enterprise. And what that, I think, did is it created an education debate in our country which was marked mostly by messianic believers in certain things. So I think it shifted the nature of the policy debate from an evidence-based debate, which it should be, to a polar debate where I just believe teachers should be accountable, so I'm going to run with this bad standardized test score. Or I believe the status quo is a lot better and that teachers are being forced to teach in myopic ways to limited tests, and so I'm going to resist all of this. And then you had some renegade states like Texas and Alaska, which makes our country interesting, that said, forget this. We don't want anything to do with this level of federal intrusion. But I think what we're left with, or one result of this very specific, very intrusive federal approach to supporting public schooling, is an incredibly polarized public debate.
From our perspective, and when I say ours, the teachers union here in Illinois, we had been working on changing teacher evaluation because our teachers in large majorities were saying this system doesn't work for me. We had people saying they hadn't gotten any feedback in years, that they weren't observed, that if they were observed, they got a checklist in their mailbox, that they hadn't talked to anybody about teaching and learning for years and years. So up until that point, we were working with joint committees, district and teacher unions together to try to make to structure a more meaningful evaluation system. What Race at the Top did is said, okay, you can do that and have fun and go at it, but by the way, put in student growth. So your idea that you're going to have a conversation about teaching and learning that doesn't include, in a very structured way, student growth scores is not going to be accepted anymore. I think in Illinois, I do need to say that we did get involved because we wanted to we knew this was going to happen, and we wanted to bring some level of common sense to a set of policies that, looking around the country, you could see were being implemented with by people who didn't know what it was like to teach. So we said, we're going to get involved in this. And we insisted, and it's in our law, that the teachers were going to be a part of the equation in terms of figuring out in every district, and we already talked about, because of local control, we have 870 almost school districts. So in every school district, a joint committee comprised of administrators and teachers appointed by the union are going to sit down to try to figure out what the right set of policies are for that district regarding student growth. And that was very, very important to us. So we were part of sort of big negotiations about that. And what the sort of refrain was that school management couldn't impose anything they wanted, and teachers' unions couldn't block. So then you have a little bit of a dilemma around, okay, a joint committee, what if they can't agree? So what we did is we said that if they agree, if those two parties can agree on any part of what is in our law, which is all of it, all the things that are around student growth, how much weight any assessment would have, what the assessments are, issues like that. If they couldn't agree, they would default to a state model. And then we were part of creating that state model. So my I guess you'd have to call it my bias on this, is that the assessments that are closest to the teacher are closest to the curriculum, closest to the teaching, are the best assessments to use around whether or not students are learning. So we've pushed really hard not to have standardized tests be a part of this equation. And we've been pretty successful in that.
How does one ever monitor whether the reform you put in place is working or not? And how can a federal bureaucracy, because federal or any bureaucracy comes with some inefficiencies, how can you keep the spirit alive undergirding any reform without killing it with compliance requirements? It's the same with teacher evaluation. People might want to do this, but because principals need to evaluate somebody 4 times and there has to be a month between any 2 observations, and you have to spend exactly 15 minutes doing that, and you have to fill out these paperwork forms, the spirit, and I think that happens in Race to the Top, the spirit that did underlie many of the reforms, I think is getting or has gotten trumped by all of the compliance paperwork that has to happen. Any of the big interventions, I'm afraid, there's a certain lack of trust built in there. I would love for there to be enough trust that I didn't have to fill out 7 pieces of paper. I'd like to be able to fill out 1, but I don't think that'll happen.
And I think one thing that's really important, we only end up with 16 Race to the Top state winners, if you count the 3 different phases. There was a lot of other activity in other states. So one of the, I think, benefits of that program were multiple states passing new pieces of education legislation. I think the biggest flurry of legislative activity on education reform in those 2 to 3 years. So right now we've got 44 states now on the hook for new evaluation systems, much larger number than just the 16 that won Race to the Top funding. But when we lead and host meetings to try and help these states with their implementation challenges, I think one thing you hear a lot about is communication and engagement and buy-in from teachers and principals. So as much as you have a few leading states like a Tennessee out there several years ahead, already into implementation, where teachers and principals believe the system can work and is actually making a difference, we've got a number of states at the threshold right now, just at the implementation phase. So they're struggling a lot with how to communicate effectively about why these reforms will make a difference for teachers. They're struggling with some of the design issues and need to come back and probably refine the systems, especially around some of the measures of student growth. And then a lot of times we hear about principals and observers who are just burdened and overburdened by how much time they're supposed to spend observing their teachers. And I'd say those are probably the top 3 issues.
Well, I think it's really hard to be able to effectively gauge how successful the changes were. I mean, so I think we can very clearly determine the effect, the positive effect in terms of removing, a number of barriers that I think the federal government, I think many states and local districts saw as preventing progress in a host of areas. So one of those would be, for example, many states having a last in, first out type of policy around how reductions in force would work for their teachers, with basic seniority dictating by state law how a reduction in force would go. And I think many people who are leaders in unions recognize that that's not really a nuanced policy, and if we're looking to try to ensure that we're going to keep the best teachers in our school districts, especially when we're facing a fiscal crisis and we're going to see an increase in these reductions in force caused by less money in our districts, we need to be doing what we can to retain our best teachers. And some of those may be teachers who have just recently begun in the district. And so there wasn't much incentive before Race to the Top to be taking these types of acts, other than, I think, doing the right thing. And so even union leaders who felt like this was the right thing, had a really difficult time trying to bring their own constituencies along. But when you had, money out there, like Race to the Top put, that made it, I think, easier for people to come to the table and say, this is something we need to do in the interests of our entire state. Now, this caused a few problems in terms of then people coming along and saying, agreed, this is something we need to do, and we're willing to then sacrifice. But then when the money doesn't come, I think many people feel that there's a bait and switch. And the next time that you have a policy like this or a Race to the Top type of program, you're going to have a harder time getting these stakeholders to come along. So that's, I think, one problem. Another problem is just then really trying to measure down the road how some of these changes have truly affected our schools, which is always a problem, I think, with education policy. And we have really strong research organizations like we have here at the University of Chicago that can help with that. But the changes are sometimes, so far down the road that, a lot of people who were very much involved in this have already moved on to different things, and it's hard to really establish a true continuity to allow for a number of these programs to build upon themselves, because by the time you can see whether or not true positive change has been effectuated, people, are in different places.